everybody. Good morning. We're going to get started with this panel. All right. Thank you. Okay, I know we're starting a few minutes late on our panel, so I'm going to jump right in and get us going because I'm sure that the audience is going to have a plethora of questions for our faculty panel today. So, thank you all for joining us. My name is Natalie Colbert. I'm the Executive Director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs here at HKS. I'm also a proud class of 2008 MPP, so it's also my reunion year. And I am pleased to moderate and host this panel today. The title of our panel is going to be Perspectives on the Future of the Global Order, so just small topic. So let me briefly introduce our distinguished panelists, and then we'll jump right in. So first we have, of course, Dr. Graham Allison. He is the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government here at HKS. He is a leading analyst of national security issues with a special interest in China, Russia, nuclear weapons, and decision-making. He is, of course, also the founding dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government. And until 2017, he was also the director of the Belfer Center. He was, of course, previously Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Clinton and a special advisor to the Secretary of Defense under President Reagan. And of note, he has the sole distinction of having twice been awarded the Distinguished Public Service Medal. So thank you, Graham, for joining us. Next, we have Dr. Tony Saich. He is the director of the Rajwali Foundation Institute for Asia and the Daewoo Professor of International Affairs. He teaches courses on comparative political institutions, democratic governance, and transitional economies with a focus on China. And he is also a guest professor at the School of Public Policy and Management at Tsinghua University in China. Thank you, Tony, for joining us. Next, we have Dr. Zoe Marks, who is a lecturer in public policy here at HKS. Her research and teaching focuses on the intersections of conflict and peace building, as well as gender and intersectional inequality and African politics. Among other active projects, she is examining how wartime experiences shape individual well-being and community reintegration after war, looking at cases in Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Thank you, Zoe. And last but not least, Dr. Matthew Bunn is the James Schlesinger Professor of the Practice of Energy, National Security, and Foreign Policy. He has previously served as an advisor to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, as a study director at the National Academy of Sciences, and as editor of Arms Control Today. His research interests include nuclear theft and terrorism, nuclear arms control and strategic stability, as well as nuclear proliferation and nuclear energy. So thank you, Matt. Okay. Jumping right in, so the title of the panel, Perspectives on the Future of the Global Order. I just want to level set what we mean when we're saying global order. So of course, this is the concept in international relations known as the liberal international order, the rules-based international order established after World War II and largely led by US and Western countries. It's describing this rules-based structured relationships built around international cooperation, multilateral institutions, et cetera. But of course, the debate also centers around the future of what that looks like, other versions, multipolar distribution of power, other interpretations of what institutions and norms might look like. The debate about this different vision for a future world order is, of course, not really new, but has been reinvigorated with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and kind of put front and center in many international fora. So one inspiration for today's discussion is actually this theme being put in front and center at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, where, as the organizers of that conference noted, it had provided an opportunity for everyone there to take stock of alliance cohesion and political commitment to the rules-based international order. So, against that backdrop, I want to dig into some of the specific angles here, and again, we won't be able to cover all of it, but I want to go first to the role of China and Russia in this conversation, and Graham, to you first to draw on your expertise in both of these countries and regimes. Help us unpack the nature of their current relationship. These countries both have a different perception on what an international order should look like. You go back to February 2022, Xi Jinping invites Putin to the Olympic Games. Afterwards, they issue a bilateral statement. They talk about a friendship that would know, quote, no limits. Later that month, of course, Putin invades Ukraine. And since then, there's been a lot of analysis, criticism, and a look at how China engages with Russia and what that dynamic looks like. So how significant or strong is this partnership? Are there limits to the no limits? And what is your view of the challenges posed by closer Russia-China alignment?
So thank you very much, and great question. Can you hear? If you can't wave hands, I'll try to talk louder. And let me first just say how thrilling it is to see so many graduates of the Kennedy School back. We're proud of what you're doing. You make your old professors proud, and the younger ones too. So thank you very much for that. But Natalie's is a great question. I'll try to be. She said I got 5 minutes to sort of capture the whole thing. I'd say the first thing, the relationship between China and Russia is puzzling because it is indeed one of the most remarkable, unnatural wonders of the world. Okay? In one line, Xi and Putin have constructed the most consequential undeclared alliance in the world. And I'm going to try to unpack that because for most of Washington and most of the press, and maybe for some of you, this has been so unbelievable that you can't believe it. Okay? I actually wrote a piece about it quoting Marx, not Karl, but Groucho, in which he said, "What are you going to believe, me or your damn lying eyes?" Okay? So your damn lying eyes would suggest that this is the most consequential undeclared alliance in the world. And it's so contrary to what we know about geopolitics and history that it can't be what it appears to be. But I think if we look at the facts, they're pretty hard to ignore. So to put that proposition in context, let me offer you 5 propositions briefly. Okay? So first, China is a meteoric rising power. If you haven't noticed, over your lifetime, China has risen further and faster on more dimensions than any nation ever in history. GDP is not everything, but it is the substructure for international power. And if you compare China's GDP in 1970 with today, or compare the US's GDP in 1970 and today, so the US GDP in constant dollars, constant 2015 dollars, has risen from $5 trillion in 1970 to about $20 trillion today. Over this same period, China's GDP has risen, so US GDP fourfold, from 5 to 20. Over this same period, 1970 till today, China's GDP rose how many times? Take a guess. 75. 75. So do it again. 75 times growth in your lifetimes, okay? Or at least for some of you. Including me, actually. Sorry. Second, the US is a colossal ruling power. I don't need to belabor that, but never since Rome, in any case, has a single power exercised such global influence. There's a reason why historians call the 20th century the American century. And as Natalie said, the US in the aftermath of World War II basically shaped the international order that we've been living in since. Third, as Thucydides taught us, when a rapidly rising power seriously threatens to displace a major ruling power, stuff happens. And you can read the rest in Thucydides' book. So the rapid rise of China and its impact on the US and the international order that the US has shaped is the defining international challenge, defines the international challenge for all of us today and for as far as any eye can see. So fourth, Russia has been a declining power for a generation since it lost the Cold War, so it's a loser, and that's what Putin hates the most. And it collapsed as a country, and what used to be 15 republics now is only Russia and 14 other countries. Its borders were rolled back to where they were at the time of Catherine the Great. Excuse me, that's not a very comfortable hand for a country. And so it's been in a pout, in effect. It's been a disgruntled country, understandably, reasonably, in the period since then. So finally, for the relationship between the US, between China and Russia, over the period since he became president, so that's 10 years, Xi Jinping has built a totally unnatural and hard to believe, but thickly consequential alliance between China and Russia. The first country that he went to, as soon as he became president, the first person whom he went to visit, the first country which he went to visit, was Russia and Putin. He and Putin celebrate their birthdays together. Putin calls Xi his best buddy. And if you look in a report card, and I wrote a piece about this, you could look at it, and if you just look it up, the most consequential alliance, take a report card on alliances, which you ask about the ways in which they're assets and the ways in which they're liabilities, and look at the military consequences of this, the intelligence consequences of this, the economic consequences of this, the political consequences of this. In every dimension, this relationship is more consequential than the US relationship with most of our formal allies. So compare it with the US relationship with the Philippines, for example, or India, for example, or Pakistan, for example, or the Baltics, for example, or Poland, for example. And in most of those cases, our alliance relationship is more liability than assets. And in most of those relationships, China's connections with Xi, with Putin, are more assets than liabilities. So that's a long answer to a complicated question, but I would say the most consequential, undeclared alliance in the world.
All right, thank you. All right, I want to stay on China. I'm going to turn to Tony. What does Xi want, therefore, in this new, in his conception of a global order? Is China a disruptor? A country is trying to replace the existing rules with their own? Or is it really a status quo power that's just seeking to expand its influence within the existing system to use the tools of the system, but in a way that's it sees as more effective?
Yeah, also let me add, as Graham said, how pleasurable it is to see so many people back here with us today. Let me first start with two comments on Graham's remarks. I think Xi Jinping is obsessed with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He referred to it continually, and when taking power, he made an extraordinary speech about how nobody was, in his words, man enough to stand up and resist the pressures against it. So this is something which obsesses him. I think it's what brings him close to Putin. But I think there is a question about how really durable that relationship is, given the tensions that exist between them, below the two buddies, and the historical relationship. I think a second question which arises is, yes, China's rise has been meteoric, but is that meteor waning, or has it still got the potential to keep growing? And I think that is crucial in terms of the way we analyze its projection of power. Now, to turn to Natalie's questions, I think the first point is we have to bear in mind that China, of course, has been one of the major beneficiaries of globalization and the structured global order. But of course, it's frustrated to some extent because, as was said, it wasn't the creator of that global order. So parts of it it feels frustrated with, it didn't create it. That's why Jessica Chen Weiss used at the time, I think, an apt phrase, that China is a disgruntled stakeholder. I think the question, though, that's before us now is actually whether we move beyond that to a situation where China does want a new global order. And I think if we look at the rhetoric coming from Xi Jinping and out of Beijing, the answer to that is clearly yes. But I think if we dig a little bit deeper, again, we see a much more complex situation coming out of that. Just turning to Xi Jinping's own comments, in 2014, he said, yeah, we can't be a bystander. We have to be a participant, a leader. He's followed that up by saying by 2050, China needs to be a global leader in terms of composite strength and influence. And then at the recent Party Congress, he said that we should strive to shape an international order more in line with China's interests. I think what is most interesting is that whereas before China used to say its development was not necessarily a model for other countries, most recently Xi Jinping has been talking about Chinese-style modernization as actually a model for other countries around the world, which he says expressly is a distinction from Western-style modernization and liberalization and role of capital and capital markets. So within that context, I think there's a number of things which has been clear. First of all, Chinese leadership have made it clear they do intend to exert global leadership in those areas where they see the US withdrawing. Also related to that, of course, it wants to push its own agendas, as do other countries, of course, in those agencies that it sees conflict with its interests. The most noticeable being, for example, UN Human Rights Commission, where it's formed alliances with other countries to push back in that area. It's also trying to gain traction in areas that set standards for the future. Telecoms, aviation, agriculture are areas where it's tried to take global leadership roles. And coming out of that, I think we see China exerting two forms of what I would call risk mitigation. Because from Beijing's perspective, this is being forced on it by the West and by the actions of the West, in the way that Putin talks about his moves and his needs being determined by aggressive Western actions. And I think Beijing sees its strategies as a counterpoint to that, or at least that's the way it's defined in their own rhetoric. The first is what I would call geoeconomic risk mitigation. We see the theory of dual circulation, China made in China 2025 to protect industry against threats from the West. And then, of course, it wants to use the Belt and Road Initiative to exert its influence and pull others into its sphere of influence. And I think the Belt and Road Initiative has undergone a very interesting transition from the initial exporting of basically excess capacity a decade ago, building plants, roads, construction, to what I would see as a mixture of a green and tech BRI, where China's trying to export the standards for new technologies in which it has invested heavily, because I think it sees quite rightly that great power comes from those countries that set global standards in the industries of the future. And I think that's what it sees in terms of its geoeconomic risk mitigation. And then, of course, there's the geopolitical, and I think Graham has covered that perfectly well in the sense of strengthening relations with those countries that reject the US domination of the global order, as Graham said, best represented in the unspoken or unmentioned alliance, but really is an alliance with Russia and the relationship with Putin. So the reality is that certain parts of the global order have served China extremely well. It's a big supporter of certain parts of that, but there's no doubt that it wants to restructure many of those institutions, and I would say more importantly, norms to appropriate much more closely those values that Beijing is espousing as being important for itself, and now increasingly through Chinese-style modernization for other countries to follow as well. And much of that criterion is a rejection of the kind of trading and economic orders which have brought prosperity over recent decades.
All right. Thank you. So Zoe, I'm going to turn to you now. We've talked a little bit about how China and Russia perceive the grievances, or their grievances that they have towards the current kind of status quo rules-based order. A lot of those resonate with countries elsewhere in the world, in what we'd call the global south or the non-aligned states. You see this playing out in the UN voting record as it relates to Ukraine, et cetera. In your view, how do countries in the global south see their role in shaping the international system?
This is a great question. Hi, everyone. It's so exciting to see so many generations represented here, so welcome back. I think there are a couple of things that are really important to understand. So when you're talking about everyone else is the vast majority of the world, right? China is a big populous player, but it has a declining population. My sort of area of focus and specialization is Africa, which is the only region in the world that has a growing population, and 1 in 3 people by the end of this century will be African. And so that is, I think, a really important thing to keep in mind. If we think about some of the critiques of democracy, for instance, in the United States, how can the president be elected without winning the popular vote? That's the sort of same idea of how can the world be run without winning the popular vote. The population that is most affected by most of the global order doesn't get to set the rules of the game. And so, the first point I want to bring us to is just that most countries in the global south have this history of non-alliance, right? That they're not aligned in the Cold War with the US and Russia and their spheres of influence. And this is actually where the term third world originated. It was not to refer to countries that were somehow behind developmentally, but actually to refer to this third way of ordering the world. In my class in African politics, I teach students that we should think of this current global order in some ways as being defined by African independence movements. If it wasn't for the end of colonialism, which African countries effected themselves by throwing off colonial governance, we wouldn't have this notion of equal and independent states that make up the United Nations. So I want to just start there because I think it's important to understand that the goal for most of these countries is autonomy, sovereignty, and independence, right? That's the purpose of non-alignment. Non-alignment is really just saying we need to have the maneuvering space to not have to do what we're told. And so going back to your framing of the rules-based order, the liberal international order, this sort of democratic piece that if we could just have free trade and democratic governance globally, this is the sort of US and Western model, all good things will follow. And from most developing countries, and I'm really focusing primarily on African countries' perspective, the United States and its wealthy white friends has been the rule maker, the rule interpreter, and the rule enforcer. And to the extent that that's happened hand in glove with the UN, that's in part because they see the US as using the UN as a place in which it can bring votes together. It can use aid on the one hand bilaterally to get kind of compliance in a multilateral context. And this isn't a particularly anti-colonial perspective, it's just the fact of how multilateralism has played out and the way that the US has brought countries together through both the UN and through its bilateral relationships. And the problem is that a lot of countries see this as relatively arbitrary enforcement of the rules, that the rules are kind of being made behind the scenes and then the United States and some of its friends don't have to follow them. And so I think when the critique is coming from Russia or China, it's not that it's like being said for the first time by those leaders. It's rather that this is common knowledge in most of the world, and it's the common worldview or interpretation of global events. And so then the question is, well, what next, right? And I think that's what's really challenging is that nowhere in this conversation are we talking about Nigeria determining the world order or an alliance of Latin countries determining the world order, or Southeast Asia being able to leverage its weight along with other countries in the global south to buffer China in a meaningful, competitive way, right? And so the challenge is that Russia, China, and the US, to the extent that we're thinking about a multipolar world as the kind of fact of the world, they're playing very different games. And so in Africa, for instance, Russia is backing up dictators through the Wagner Group, but it's primarily working with military states. China is very interested in providing infrastructure, which African countries across the board from South Africa to Egypt desperately need. They still need infrastructural development in order to leverage their economic potential. China provides infrastructure that has a sign that basically says made in China, paid for China, brought to you by China. As much as we can nitpick and complain about the debt that comes with those projects, the problems with some of the kind of quality control, lack of job creation, what the US has been doing is bankrolling health programs, right? And so in Nigeria, one of the countries that I work in, if you arrive at the airport in Abuja, you see this gleaming new airport terminal. You know that it's being run by a Chinese company that's backed by the Chinese government that's funded it. You don't walk down the street and think every pregnant woman has health care that's been made possible by the United States. So there's a serious branding problem. But all of the African governments that I've talked with and met with, I have students who come from these countries and are part of this leadership, they need all of those things. They need security support, they need health care, they need a new airport, right? And so the challenge, I think, from a world order perspective, thinking about how can the Global South leverage some of this ambiguity and this moment is really, how do you work bilaterally effectively if you have superpowers, great powers such as they are, that aren't playing the same game? Because they're not actually competing, right? They're doing different things. I think what's really key is we need to start thinking about how do we achieve coordination in the sort of vein of the non-aligned movement, where countries who have less power, economically they have less power, politically, militarily, even geographically, they need to be able to cooperate and know what the terms of engagement have been so they can get a better deal.
All right. So I think we're going to come back around. We're going to come back around to several of the themes that are raised here, but I want to add one more layer before we do that, and that's to turn to Matt on some of the questions that arise in the sphere of nuclear policy, nuclear issues, when it comes to this kind of global order and what's changing or what's being challenged, particularly by the conflict in Ukraine. So what are you concerned about? What are the questions that are most raised for you about how this is playing out and the effects, the ripple-on effects about what it means for the future of nuclear deterrence, alternatives to the credible security assurances in that space?
So thanks. It's a great and difficult question, and I find it sort of remarkable that the war in Ukraine as a challenge to the global nuclear order is only really coming up in the last of these questions. It seems to me the most fundamental element of the global nuclear order, in a certain sense, is this sort of post-World War II agreement that it's not okay to just invade neighboring countries and seize chunks of their territory. Now, to be fair, the United States has, led invasions of foreign countries not authorized by the Security Council as well. But in general, we weren't just, except a long time ago, just seizing major chunks of territory in the way that Russia is trying to do now. And what we're seeing is a Russia willing to violate pretty much every element of the rules-based order. If you look at the Helsinki Final Act, there are 10 principles, and Russia's violated at least 9. The 10th is arguable. They've thrown the Conventional Forces in Europe agreement in the trash. They've thrown the Vienna document in the trash. Basically, all of the agreed elements of the European order that it was participating in, gone. But what we're seeing is that when the violator of rules, both international laws and norms, is a nuclear armed power with a veto on the Security Council, and by the way, that means they're specially charged with protecting international peace and security, and has major conventional forces and huge reserves of oil and natural gas, it becomes extremely difficult for the international community to really do anything about it. It's been surprising to me how well the international community has managed to respond in that circumstance, with sanctions that have really hurt the Russian economy, accumulating more now. It looked like it wasn't really hurting much in the first 9 months or so. and with remarkable support to Ukraine that has led to an outcome that I'm not sure even the Ukrainians expected, that they have been able so far to fight off the Russians and prevent them from conquering Ukraine. But it's sort of a masterclass in the dilemmas of deterrence. On the one hand, Russia has succeeded in at least slowing the US and Western provision of more and more weapons to Ukraine. The Biden administration initially said, probably precision rockets is not a good idea, and then decided, let's give them the HIMARS. And then they said, tanks is probably not a good idea. Let's give them the tanks. And now we're seeing the same thing happening with F-16s. So finding where is Putin's red line has been a difficult challenge. Now, I remain concerned that every day this war goes on, more people die, more people suffer, and there's an elevated risk of nuclear weapons use. The tension between the United States and Russia is higher than it has been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I disagree with my Belfer colleague Kevin Ryan that Putin is, pushing toward nuclear weapons use, but I think he's holding it open as an option if he were to get desperate. I could imagine the use of a small number of tactical nuclear weapons against a Ukrainian armored breakthrough, should that occur in the upcoming offensive. I could imagine Putin has referred several times to the precedent set by the US bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What is that precedent? We bombed these cities and then we demanded that Japan surrender. And I could easily imagine him using a small number of nuclear weapons and then demanding that Ukraine agree to Russia's terms, or the next one will be on Kharkiv, or the next one will be on Odessa, or what have you. And figuring out how to respond and how to deter such an action is extraordinarily difficult when Ukraine is not a treaty ally of the United States. It is interesting how well deterrence in the NATO alliance has worked. Putin has been extraordinarily careful not to do anything that would bring NATO into the war. And I think that's a combination of conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence. Drawing back to the big picture of the global order for nuclear weapons, until now, it has actually been remarkably successful. Less than 5% of the states in the world have nuclear weapons, and that's the same as was true 35 years ago. That's an amazing public policy success story. It's never been true before in the history of our species that the most powerful weapon we had available was so widely forsworn. More than 4/5 of all the nuclear weapons in the world have been destroyed over the course of the time since the end of the Cold War. More than half of all of the states that used to have potential nuclear bomb material on their soil have gotten rid of it. And by the way, a large portion of that work was done by a program suggested here at the Belfer Center. It's clear that public policy has managed to reduce risk over the years. And yet, when we look at the world today, you have this intense hostility between the United States and Russia, growing hostility between the United States and China, intense hostility between the United States and North Korea, burgeoning nuclear arsenal in China. They kept their arsenal small for decades and now have decided not to do that anymore. They're building hundreds of new nuclear missile silos, new submarines, new bombers, new mobile missiles. North Korea is testing another missile every 5 minutes. In a way that's unprecedented even for Kim Jong-un in the last year. Iran is right at the edge of the ability to produce nuclear weapons material. They could produce enough material for 2 to 3 bombs in a matter of weeks, and it's not obvious whether the international inspection system would detect analyze, and then we'd be able to make decisions about military responses in time to stop them. So the picture has darkened a good bit. One of the things my group is doing, we got a grant a little while ago to launch a global research network involving, among others, lots of scholars from the global south, as well as the ones from the nuclear-armed states, on the theme of rethinking nuclear deterrence. How do we think about how to reduce the horrifying danger of nuclear war, and at the same time, for the long term, can we imagine how to get out of this mess, how to build a world that doesn't rely on nuclear weapons. The American nuclear strategist Frederick Clay many years ago asked the question, can deterrence have a happy ending? And so we're working on trying to envision that.
Excellent. Okay. So I want to shortly turn to audience questions, but I'm going to do one quick lightning round. So a minute apiece, either responding to any of the comments that have been raised as part of the discussion, or adding any additional thoughts to this huge discussion that we haven't yet touched on, but to kind of whet the appetite of some of the questions that are come from the audience.
So if I make a quick comment, since the topic is the international order, again, if we're doing big picture, so think 1/2, 1/4, 1/5. That's US market share of global GDP, end of World War II, end of the Cold War, today. Now, this is not because the US has been declining. The US is not declining. The US has been growing, but there's a lot of other countries that have grown more and faster. The end of World War II was very unnatural. Most of the rest of the world had been destroyed, or many of the industrial countries had been destroyed. But the consequence of that is a fundamental tectonic shift in global power, which inevitably is reflected in global order. So when people like Putin and Xi, and as Zoe reminded us, most of the third world say, we want a multipolar power, they're pushing on a very open door. The tectonics are shifting to a multipolar world. No longer does Saudi Arabia or Iran or South Africa or Brazil or Mexico feel obliged to ask permission from the US to do what they might want to do. If you have half of a market share in a domain, you can pretty much set the standards, you can pretty much coerce the others. As Chinese like to say about the American-led international order, you make the rules and give the orders, and you expect us to comply. But of course, you're exceptional, so the rules don't apply to you. I would say that's a little bit exaggerated, but roughly correct. Yeah.
Thank you, Graham. Tony?
Yeah, I mean, maybe two comments. The first is that when I was still at Ford Foundation many years ago, we funded a project trying to look at UN reform, particularly reform of the Security Council. And I think there was a brief opportunity where that part of the traditional institutions might have been reformed, but it was quite clear, quite obviously, those in the Security Council with the power were totally resistant to any change. So I think we kind of see two blocks where focus needs to take place. One is, if you like, the kind of traditional Bretton Woods institutions and others, which is very, very difficult, of course, for the obvious reason. The second, where I think there's more potential, is around what I would think of in terms of provision of new global public goods. And there, if you think about things like global commons, global regulations, as Zoe and Graham have said, so many other countries have the vested stake in being part of that discussion, that might provide some potential for a broader base set of actors to come together. And then one very brief comment in terms of impact on global economy. One interesting fact, which hasn't been noticed quite so strongly, is the influence of Chinese state-owned enterprises in the global economy. And Chinese SOEs now make up 4.5% of global GDP. That is more than the UK, more than France, and more than a whole range of other countries. So the actions in Beijing influencing policies towards their state-owned enterprises does have a major impact on global economic practice.
Thank you. Zoe.
Oh, there's so many things. I'm just like, oh, I have something to say about that. I think one thing I just want to lift up is people and like populations and what people want. So there used to be this idea that, at least it was the talking point, was that, that China doesn't care what you do in your own backyard, right? And that was its like fundamental distinction from the United States. The US and Bretton Woods institutions, international financial institutions would come in and they would have all these strings attached. So you could get a bunch of money as long as you did X, Y, Z. And China was like, you do what you want. We're mostly interested in this specific agreement or contract. And I think what's shifted as we move towards a multipolar world, where at minimum, the US and its European friends, China and Russia, are trying to throw their own weight around, is that actually China does care and Russia does care. And what they care most about is not what's happening domestically, but that there isn't a bunch of churn with the people with whom they've made agreements, right? They want stability. And so it's looking more and more like authoritarian alliances. And that is very different than strings attached that created neoliberal institutions, that forced elections when countries may or may not have had domestic and civil society capacity, that may or may not have been on their own self-determined schedule. And so where people come in is that they're now kind of stuck between having elections and the sort of de jure performance of democracy, which is by far the ascendant and modal form of governance around the world, but with this authoritarian backstop that's now available to leaders. And I think we just don't know how that's going to play out, but it's a very, very different approach to thinking about what's happening at the domestic level because of this multipolarity that's emerging.
Okay. Matt?
So I think one of the things I observe about the current global picture is that it seems to me all three of the largest powers, the United States, China, and Russia, are behaving as though they've forgotten the concept of the security dilemma. That what they see as a defensive deterrent action on their part, the other party might see as an offensive threat and then respond in ways that actually undermine their security. I think there's a lot of fallacy at the last move going on. And I feel as though all of us need a little bit more strategic empathy to think through, okay, if I do this, how will it look to the other side? Can I deter and defend in a way that's perhaps a little less provocative in order to actually maximize my own security, taking into account the responses I'm provoking?
All right, thank you. All right, so we have a lot on the table here. We're going to go to Q&A from the audience. We're going to start over here. Everyone has been through this drill before.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself, name, class year, and get straight to the questions.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. This is Francis Sun. I'm a mid-career NPA 20 years ago, 2003. It's been 20 years to be here. It's very happy to be here. The Professor Allison, Professor said, they're almost the same, so nothing changed. So in the past 20 years, in addition to what else I'm doing, I'm the senior fellow of the Center for China and Globalization. You know that. So my question is, so when I was at the Kennedy School 20 years ago, it's more like global. We feel more connected. And in the past 20 years, it seems the globalization has been a kind of a stop or even reversed. So what would you say about this? And what should we do to help the world more global or more connected? Thank you very much.
All right. So maybe let's start with Graham.
So again, welcome back, and we're proud of what you're trying to do. So I think the globalization, huge topic. And I think most of the current public discussion about deglobalization is delusional, okay? So globalization is in the first instance the recognition of the ways in which around a very small planet, actions of one party have impact on everybody else. That's in the first instance a physical fact. So whoever emits greenhouse gases, they emit greenhouse gases into the same biosphere. Makes no difference whether they're American greenhouse gases or South African greenhouse gases or Chinese greenhouse gases. They all go into the same limited bathtub, in effect. Right? And all therefore have the same consequences for everybody. Little by little, we're recognizing this in more and more dimensions. But the physical reality, the first fundamental reality. Secondly, technology keeps advancing in ways that tightens this small globe. So now everybody can talk to everybody virtually. Now a missile launched anywhere can within 30 minutes destroy a target anywhere. So that's just a physical fact. Then consciousness. By now most of us have waken up to the fact there are 8 billion people. Most of them don't look quite like us. Most of them don't necessarily speak English. But the Kennedy School is now much more internationalized even than when you were here. So one of the wonders in my class is the fact that when we say, we think, people say, hey, excuse me, in India, does this include India? There's a lot of people who are Indians, and we don't think that, or Chinese. We don't think that. So we think has now got to take a little bit bigger picture. So I think I try to explain to folks in Washington who are talking about deglobalization, I say, I'm totally in favor of deglobalization. Let's just have everything only American. So first let's start with food. So you cannot go to an Indian restaurant, you cannot go to a Chinese restaurant, you cannot go to a Mexican restaurant. No, we don't want to do that, okay. So I would say, yes, of course, there will be some domains in which they'll be more concerned about the security consequences of globalization, and we'll all be much more conscious of it. And one of the things we'll learn, I think it's what Zoe said, is that not everybody's American. Not everybody agrees with the US. And if you just tell them again, even louder, that doesn't necessarily persuade them. Yeah.
All right, let's take the question over here.
Hello, can you hear me? I'm former student of Professor Graham, 1998. 2-3 days before I moved here, my generation, we were in the mid-30s, and we convened a dialogue in Washington with the president of the World Bank, managing director of the IMF, come through, my boss, the president of the IDB, to better understand globalization. But far more is to encourage my generation to spur the second generations of reforms, far more political. What happened? An indicator. My generation, what I call the absent generation, had an exodus from 1 to 30, from the public to the private sector in only 2 years. I was chatting with Madame Christine Lagarde about the age of Macron. So our activities for 20-something years was to generate an intergenerational dialogue. Now, 5 generations, I was with Michel Camdesrou and my boss there in the 90s. They were older elite group, but I was the youngest, and I'm 62. So our institution, plus all your knowledge, is how can we sustain Western democracies? Now we're lucky to use these financial institutions to support our expansion to the US, critically needed, and with Madame Lagarde, ideally to Central and Eastern Europe. This is an invitation to all of you, not only to discuss leadership, to think leadership, but to act leadership. I have not here, since I've been yesterday here, talking about millennials, about Gen Zs. When about our forum is entirely in the hands of the younger generations. This is our moral and ethical duty. But we're way, way behind in support and intergenerational dialogue up, down. When younger generation says, oh, you are responsible for climate change, and I said, well, my parents and me, I was born 15 years after World War II, we have to rebuild trust in humankind. So based on your phenomenal wisdom and all your activities, and you are parents of millennials and grandparents of Gen Zs, think on alpha generation. Let's use media to reach out, support the developed world and the values. Possibly the most important contribution in our lifetime is to secure the legacy of democracy.
Can you clarify the question that you're posing? The question?
I think
Okay, you got it? Okay.
I got it.
Actually, it was not a question. It was a thought that I wanted to share with my professor. We launched the forum with Joe Nye and
Okay.
Tom Mack today, but was more a reflection to share with my colleagues, because we have responsibility to engage those
Sure.
generations
Okay.
proactively.
Let me
And
just-
Thank you. Yeah,
yes.
let me turn to Graham.
I would say I agree. I agree strongly that the proposition that the multi-generational development, such that when you see, one of the wonders of the opportunities of being at Harvard, every year shows up thousands of young people. Some of them are 18 years old in the college, or 17. Some are 25, Kennedy School. Some are 35. But they all come from everywhere, remarkably talented people, and most of them believe they can change the world. And some of them are going to do so, for better. So I would say that's the wonder of being part of a university, and part of our responsibility is to try to make sure that every generation of younger people coming, and not just here, but elsewhere, understand, first they're coming into a world in which things are changing increasingly rapidly, and in which they've got to be agile, and they got to be smart, and they got to adapt, but at the same time, they got to think about their responsibilities. And I would say I'm not pessimistic about that. I think actually each generation that I see showing up have as much sense that they're part of a global world in which they have global responsibilities, probably more than in my generation. Yeah.
Any other reactions to that before we go to the next question? No? Okay, here.
Hi, I'm Moshmi Khan. I'm mid-career 2008. Hello to my classmates. Hello. I have a two-part question related to the tools needed to deal with the new order. One regarding students. What are the skills that you think that we should be learning or that should be teaching at the Kennedy School? I remember I got an A in managing people, time, and resources in Nancy Katz, and I fell on my face and failed when I moved to Asia, and so I would love to know. And the second question is related to multilaterals, institutions. I have the privilege of representing the United States of America on the ADB, Asian Development Bank Board of Directors as the alternate executive director, where we are very well represented by Kennedy School. My boss, Ambassador Chantel Wong, is a Kennedy School alum, right, of your class. And Haynes Robert, our senior commercial officer, is also here for the reunion. But what I'm really struck by is many of the discussions you said about China, SOEs, all of these issues are very relevant, but frankly, there's still an expectation the US is going to lead. Right now at the ADB, we're looking at safeguards. Once in a 10-year, we're really looking at this. Yet, when we look behind us, no one is there. They said, go ahead, we're with you. And they expect that we're gonna lead on these human rights issues, but at the same time, we don't have that support. So basically, what are the skills we need to learn, including even now, to make change in the new order? And secondly, what role does multilaterals play, or should they play, in this new order?
Okay. Maybe, Zoe, do you want to take the first one on students, and then Tony, if you have anything to add as well?
Sure. I mean, you'll get a different answer from each of us on what students need to learn, because we teach different things, and we all think that it's what we teach. But I'll say one thing. I just had a conversation with the graduating joint degree students, MPP MBA, and I asked her what was most impactful, and she, there's a selection effect. We were having coffee, she said, my class. But the thing that she said really resonated, and what she wanted to better understand was why I teach students to the power of imagination. And I think it is something that we've been a little reluctant to name, but it is increasingly the business that the Kennedy School trades in, which is we try to train students for a world that we have not yet observed, and some of us cannot yet imagine. And we want them to do that imagining work so that they can affect that world, so they can create it, so they can be the architects of it, but also so that they have the right skills for it. And I think that that sort of future casting is not just about where's the trend line going so that you're not surprised by a hiccup or a change in direction, but also how do you imagine it so that you can articulate it for others? And I would say across the board, if there is a sort of consensus, it would be that one. And it's hard to put that in the brochure, but I think it's something that we're working toward.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. I mean, I think, there's the obvious basic skill sets that one can imagine. But then I would agree absolutely that trying to provide students with the possibility just to imagine alternative futures. And I think one of the advantages of the Kennedy School is one of the things that Graham alluded to, just the very international nature of the school now. It doesn't matter which class you're in. As Graham says, you say, we think, and then 10 people say, well, wait a minute, we don't think that. So trying to provide that environment where you can hear those different voices and engage in different ways is important, which is becoming very difficult, I must say, in the current kind of political climate. And so allowing those kinds of alternatives to be expressed. One of the things I try and do in my class, which I think is important, is to try and get, say for example in the China course, what I try and do is get the students to understand how does China see things and how do things operate within China, and it has its own logic. And I think if you can help sort of students understand that different countries see things in different ways with different sets of logic, that becomes, I think, quite important skills for students to take.
All right. Let's try to get in at least 2 more questions. We'll go here.
Thank you very much. I'm Luis Monsalve from Colombia. I was the former ambassador to Colombia to China since 2019 to 2022. So this conversation or question was mostly what me and my colleagues from the region were having during the 3 years and so that I was there. China has become the trade partner #1 for most of South America during the last 20 years or so, and also one of the most important, the main source of investment in also in many areas like infrastructure, telecommunications, energy, and so. So seeing and looking at this growing confrontation between the US and China, what's the position we, Latin America, should take towards that confrontation? I know that So gave some tips about what she's working and what's going on with Africa and other regions, but I don't know if any of you have some specific, I would say, advice or point regarding Latin America. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anyone?
I'll
Takers?
give a brief comment. So, obviously, this is the issue that I'm most consumed by. So, I published a book, and just as Reagan became president, called Destined for War: Can the U.S. and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? And I think it provides a good diagnosis of the problem. It doesn't provide much of an answer to what to do about it. And I've been struggling with this since. But my big takeaway would be that for Latin Americans, as well as I say the same thing to somebody from Asia just came to see me yesterday. And I said, don't assume that there's a monopoly of wisdom about dealing with this problem in either Washington or Beijing. And do recognize that if the US and China end up in a war, the consequences are likely to be catastrophic for you. So you have a reasonable, you have a reason to be interested in this problem beyond the fact of what's happening somewhere else. It's, you have a stake in it. You have a basis for having a view. So I would say other countries should be trying to contribute to understanding what's actually happening in this relationship and being much more creative and vocal about their stakes and about what they think could be done. I mean, I said to this person yesterday, I said, imagine what Lee Kuan Yew would do. He didn't imagine that everybody else knew everything more than he did. He was a little guy in a little country that, why should he be able to have a view? He could have a view because he had an insight. Strategic insight is not a monopoly of either the Americans or the Chinese. So I would say, go for ideas in this space and then be vocal about them.
Anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it almost doesn't matter which country you go to, and I go more in Southeast Asia. You hear from everywhere, we don't want to get caught in this. We want to be able to maintain our own autonomy and not be pulled into either the American or Chinese camp. That's going to become difficult. I think you have to parse different areas. Like, for example, with new technologies, it's going to be very difficult to have a Western-based internet or a Chinese-based internet. And countries are going to be forced to choose in ways that they may not wish under those circumstances. That's, I think, so I think, sort of speaking up, trying to retain that sort of space. Because, and I think, U.S. also has to recognize it cannot fulfill the needs of all the countries around the world. I mean, just the infrastructure investment that China provides, we can argue about whether it's debt trap or whatever. It's crucial for many of those countries and much appreciated. But I think there's a very interesting thing. I don't know how it is in Colombia, but looking at a lot of surveys in a lot of countries around the world, there's very different appreciations of the US and China depending on the topic you talk about. And actually, positive support for China has been dropping in many, many countries. And that, I think, is more around questions of sort of values and politics rather than the questions of kind of hard infrastructure and investment. So those tensions are there no matter what.
All right, let's squeeze in one last question. We're going to go here.
Thank you. I'm Bing Lan Xu from mid-career 2008. I'm from China, but I now live in Germany. Question is for Professor Saich and Professor Marx, if you have insights to contribute, because you touched upon my question briefly just now. I would like to know your opinion on China's, how China is doing in the competition and debate about global and regional issues in international forums and on media and in its efforts to influence the public opinion, particularly in spite of the debate about TikTok. Yeah, that's my question. Yeah.
Do you want to start, Zoe, or shall I? Okay. Yeah, I mean, banning TikTok is going to, going back to intergenerational things, that's going to alienate a very huge number of people across the world. I think it goes back to things that Zoe and others have mentioned. I mean, it depends very much the country you come from and the perceptions you have of how you look on the two different countries, and so it gets interpreted in different ways. But I think you must have noticed in Europe that there's been, I think in recent years, a very significant shift in attitude in Europe towards China. You used to have a situation where, particularly in the southern parts, Spain, Greece, Portugal, Italy, which had become more reliant on Chinese investment, they would actually move to block, for example, EU decisions about things related to human rights. That's sort of gone now. And I think there's become a significant shift in the way of thinking, particularly in Europe, about how China is seen and potential problems that come from over-reliance on Chinese investments, TikTok notwithstanding. But that leads to a whole, we don't have time to go into it, but it leads to a whole set of challenges around what is private and what is public in China. Is Huawei a private company, state-owned company? I mean, and these have major significance for policy decisions in Washington and also within the European Union.
I'll just say, I mean, I think I'm maybe being picked on. I don't know if you can hear me. They're trying, this is how they get rid of us now. It's lunchtime and the mics go off. I think I'm the millennial representative. I thought I was the token woman, but I'm also the token millennial on the panel with Natalie. So, we have two of us. Natalie has been very gracious in deferring most of her expertise, but she actually curated the entire conversation, so thank you for for being gracious and actually sharing the mic so much. But as a millennial, I've strategically avoided TikTok. I don't know how to use it. I get it like emails of TikToks to me, so I'm that type of millennial. But I think what's important is it sort of behooves me to state the obvious. A lot of disinformation and misinformation that's destroying social fabric and political fabric around the world is being passed through WhatsApp and Facebook as much as through anything else. And so this is really a conversation about technology, and if there's any topic that's ripe for re-envisioning global governance and re-envisioning what shared interests and the public good could look like at the global level, I think that's it. And I don't know who's going to lead that conversation, but if we want it to be young people because they're the ones with tech literacy, I think it's important that we not assume that that tech bros and tech wizards and the sort of Chinese people behind the curtain who are leading on technology, they can't set the rules, right? That's the end of the conversation, is it has to be part of this new alternative future. And that's, I think, what all of us are here for, whether you're here to reconnect with old friends and hear from old professors, or to find out what we're teaching the next generation. That is the sort of thing where we really need the power of imagination to think outside the box and beyond multipolarity.
All right. All right, with that, I think we're going to go into lunch, but please help me, join me in thanking again our faculty panel for taking time out today. All right, thank you everybody. Enjoy your class lunches.